Before I forget, I was asked to make one point in regard to the FTC commissioner who's been so very kind to be here, which is his comments are purely his own personal thoughts and do not reflect those of the FTC, the administration, or anybody else, really, as far as I can tell, right?
My wife?
Your wife, yeah, I know that one. Again, you have all of our bios, so I won't take valuable time on those. I'd like to start with two substantive points. First is, I view this as a really important issue for the financial sector because you have this wave of financial innovation that we've been hearing about and seeing with big data, machine learning, et cetera. And this wave is crashing into a wall of privacy concerns. And it's not that anybody wants the wall to stop all the innovation, but how it channels this is going to change who the competitors are, how they compete, what services they provide, and what prices they charge. Really fundamental points when you come down to it. So, second point that I've been emphasizing for several years now is designing the policy in this area around, by the way, I tend to refer to as data rights. So I think of that as data ownership, usage rights, privacy. It's such a long term, I've gone with data rights. So designing the rules around data rights is like 7-dimensional chess. And if any of you have played 3-dimensional chess, that's really hard in the first place. The reason it's like 7-dimensional chess is because we have so many different legitimate policy objectives simultaneously. So you can think of financial data as principally about human rights, privacy. You can think of it as principally about financial inclusion. You can think of it as principally about innovation and effectiveness, or principally about competition, like with open banking, or about national competitiveness, which brings up issues like data localization, or trade, or national security, or intellectual property law. And I'm sure I'm missing some here. So one of the toughest issues is for all of us to help the policy community to think through which things are most important, how to trade them off, and how to minimize the need to make trade-offs if there's ways to achieve multiple objectives at the same time. All right, having given you that little spiel, I have a very easy job from this point forward because I have a panel who has both assured me and demonstrated to me they are not shy. And so we're going to have this very conversational. What I've done is to group questions into 3 sets of questions. So that rather than going through more of kind of an interview format, I'll put out a set of questions around broad issues, and then we'll go through and the various panelists will speak. So the first set of questions is around innovation and obstacles to innovation. And again, they should feel free to expand beyond these 2 specific questions, but one is, what do you think are the most important financial innovations that are driven by use of personally identifiable information? And then what are the biggest obstacles to current and future innovation of this kind? So again, innovations and obstacles to them. So let me start with Joanne. What is your view?
So I think it's interesting. So the question was first framed to us as what's the most important innovation. And I think that one was really tough. But when I think of MasterCard, so all of you have one of these and one of these, right? And when you begin to think about payments, right, I think the innovations that we've used really have to do with fraud, security, right, protections of information. When you think about that really on your phone, we really have minimized the amount of personal information, right? Tokenization, encryption, how we actually move data around has really been minimized. And I think some of that has been some of the most powerful innovations around personal information. And I know that we talk about privacy as kind of an innovation to innovation, but I actually think we need to embrace privacy as part of the innovation journey. And so when I think about how we've actually looked at privacy and security, that's actually some of the baseline when we look at how we've been innovating for quite a long time at MasterCard, right? That's kind of the baseline of what we do when we look at all of the data innovation. So privacy and security is where we start, but when we look at what we do and we move transactions all around the world, those are some of the basic fundamental rights that everybody's expecting. All of you, all of the banks that are in the room that use our network, you're expecting, and all of you consumers that use our network, you're expecting that that's part of the innovation. And so minimizing personal information in all of the data practices is probably part and parcel of where we have to go moving forward. And I think that that innovation has to become really where we start from at this point in time.
Okay, thank you. Laura, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I'd like to add that I'm with Zurich Insurance, which is at least in the US, is a B2B insurance company, but we have brands all over the world that have retail insurance, life insurance, and P&C insurance. And so the use of data in insurance, personal information, has been very powerful in the sense that we've been able to create products for our customers that are more customized to them. So for example, with telematics on the personal lines auto, this is a way that we can give the customer a product that's more customized to them at a price that's more in line with their risk profile. Similarly, if you think about personal risk, things like having apps where data is collected about your lifestyle and your health risks. This is another way that we can minimize or customize insurance products based on your lifestyle and make it more applicable to you and more cost effective. And then one of the examples that I'm most proud of at Zurich in North America is that we worked with data in our claims, with our claims data, and we were able to do some predicting of when there would be a benefit to involving a nurse case manager in a claim earlier in the process, so that we could get better claims results, both for ourselves as the provider of the claims payment, but also for the people who were injured and getting them back to work more quickly and reducing things like opioid use.
Okay, Vivian?
Well, when I first read the question, I forgot to read about financial innovation. And so I thought really the most exciting thing around innovation really is the Internet of Things. And I thought, well, actually, no, we can't go there. So we're not going to Internet of Things.
Actually, Internet of Things ties into insurance, for example. So
Well,
we could get back to it.
But we're B2B. Well, I'm going to stick with B2B
All right,
rather
fair
than
enough.
B2C. So I think you've got the B2C side. I'm on the B2B side. And in relation to B2B, I think the use of personal data in the context of analytics and insight is enormously powerful. It enables businesses to better manage their risk across the board. And that's all different types of risk. The particular risk that I'm interested in is financial crime risk. And with increased access to data, with the ability to analyze it and to share it, one can develop unique insights around where actual tangible risks lie, in order to address them. And if we were to be able to do that effectively and efficiently, we could reduce the amount of financial crime. So the reality is that less than 1% of the amount of money laundered in the world is ever recovered. So financial crime is a bit of a run amok at the moment, which is very challenging for organizations when you think that not only does it have an impact on the organization and on the customer, but also on the individuals who are finally impacted. So that might be in the context of either victim of fraud or a modern slave, as the case may be. So the human impact is there, even though the financial crime infrastructure may seem quite sanitized in the middle. So I think the use of personal data, or the additional and innovative uses of personal data, enables us to better visualize where financial crime is, to make the necessary connections, not only in the context of immediate KYC, but also when looking at vendor risk assessments. So you are better empowered, organizations can be better empowered to understand their supply chain, where risks lie, where the potential suppliers are ones where they would not credibly want to go, because they may use child labor, etc. And so we can make many more informed decisions in order to have a more crime-free environment in which to operate, and to help those people who are at the end of that cycle, who are at the end of the day the victims of financial crime.
Commissioner?
Thanks. I try not to be too much of an obstacle to innovation. I think that's where I'd like to start. And one thing you do want to avoid when it comes to folks like me, folks in government, is too much innovation when it comes to regulation itself. I think part of what we're seeing now in this conversation internationally, I mean, we have Mark Zuckerberg here in Washington today speaking, is a growing awareness among consumers, among politicians, among regulators like me, among businesses, of not just the promise that we've heard about from the use of data in innovative ways, but also some of the risks. And it's important to keep some of those risks, like Joanne was talking about, in mind as we do innovation. One of the things that I worry about is that an ill-informed discussion, or a discussion about the use of data that is too histrionic and too untethered from fact, can lead people to adopt regulations that inhibit some of the really good innovation that we're seeing. I think that's a real issue. At the same time, the public is not responding to nothing. On some level, they're responding to real phenomena, and in some cases, some very real risks. And what you don't want to see is an erosion of the consumer trust that you need to support all of the innovation that we're discussing.
Yeah, I'm going to just pick up on that thread. I think part of the challenge is, right, I mean, so all of you have a device like this somewhere, right? You're probably surreptitiously looking at it because a lot of news is flashing at the moment.
And if you
I
don't
have
have
mine
one,
up here.
please leave the room. We only want modern people here.
Right? But if you think about all of the data that is crammed onto our devices, right, it's really hard for a consumer to understand the connected nature of where their personal data is being collected, how it's being shared, right? We live in a world of a connected data ecosystem, right? And the financial ecosystem is connected, right? My company operates networks, right? It's no longer just one network. It's no longer one credit and debit network, right? We have an ACH network, and increasingly now we're looking at digital identity and trying to figure out how to make that information safe and smart, right? And so it's hard for consumers to understand, how does information flow? How does it remain safe? Who is it really being shared with? And is it the raw data that's being shared? Is it a token that's being shared? Is it part of the information being shared? And so without a lot of transparency and education, individuals really don't trust that, first of all, they even understand what's going on, right? And then if we try to make it understandable, right? And yes, there's privacy notices, and those have a place, but they're not always understandable to either my 15-year-old nephew, right, who's going to jump on a video game, or my 83-year-old mother, right? It's really a challenge to trying to make things transparent, right, and simple and easy to understand. And I think that responsible companies are trying to get better and better to make it easier for the consumer to understand what is going on with their data. And I think that's one of the biggest obstacles to innovation, is that consumers are getting smarter. They understand that they own their data. They understand they want to control their data, but they don't really understand always the benefit of the bargain when they give their data, right? And so that's one of the things that we all have to, as responsible organizations, and especially financial organizations, we need to get better at figuring out, how do we make it simpler, right? How do we make it easier for our consumers, our customers, and our partners to understand what's really going on? And I think that's one of the biggest obstacles to innovation today, is that has to be part of the innovation process, and that as responsible organizations, we need to step up, yes, comply with law, but actually figure out how to go further to make it easier. And that's not so easy when, I don't know all the apps, even some of the dead ones that I need to delete, because I've forgotten even that I've loaded them on my phone. And I care about this stuff, right?
I mean, I couldn't echo trust more. I think it very much is about trust. But if I could build on that, and I think it's trust in the sense that individuals are confident that the purposes for which their data has been shared are the purposes for which it's being used, or other reasonable purposes associated with that. The transparency part, I think, is absolutely critical so that individuals have an understanding of those purposes, but cannot, and I am the first person to say, I really don't want to know how it works. Please don't tell me how it works. I'm not interested. I just want to know that when I press yes, I want that particular item, it's going to come, and it's going to come, and not 1,000 other things or advertisements for things I never were interested in the first place. So the transparency piece is, I think, where we can be very innovative. I think where the regulators are encouraging us to be innovative is how do you share what you are doing with data in a way that isn't a 20-page long legal written notice, which isn't particularly helpful. But the other side of it, I think, which is a challenge, is also managing what individual expectations are. So there's a lot of words being bandied around in terms of, they are your data rights, your rights as an individual. But what does that mean? We're to say that you have a data right, or your data subject rights, or empowering the individual in terms of their personal data. Because you really only have a right if somebody has given it to you. So the right could be a contractual right, it could be a legal right, it could be a constitutional right, but it may not necessarily transcend boundaries or geographies, as the case may be. And I think we need to be very careful about the language that we use, not to build unrealistic expectations around what these individual data rights are. Yes, individuals have rights in data. Yes, organizations have responsibilities when dealing with data. But through transparency, hopefully we can make clear both what the obligations and the responsibilities are, so we don't end up in a situation where people truly think that they have a genuine right to be forgotten, to be obliterated, their history forever. Whereas in the digital world, we know that that's practically impossible. You can stop active processing, but to actually actively delete so that you could never ever have that piece of data there ever again once it's already been shared a multi-million times across the digital ecosystem is unrealistic. So I would certainly say that's one of the big challenges we have.
So let's segue from that to the policy process issues. And again, I've got several questions that kind of work together, and people are welcome to take pieces of those or anything related. So one is, I had listed off in the 7-dimensional chess analogy a bunch of ways we could look at financial data, all of which imply policy objectives. So curious, which of the big policy goals you see as the most important, or which do you think will drive decisions by politicians and regulators, even if you don't think they're the most important? Second is, should the financial sector, as a sector, come together to develop a consensus on approaches, or is this just a subset of the larger societal issues and should be handled at that level? And I'll give you the right answer in a second after I finish the others. And then how do we ensure sufficient international cooperation? Now, I am going to abuse my moderator's privilege and give you what I think is the right answer on that second question. Just to say, I feel strongly that there are aspects that taken together make the financial sector unique in terms of you really can use 30 years worth of data to usefully make a decision. Almost all the financial data is sensitive, and there are a bunch of legal requirements, AML, KYC, sanctions, et cetera. I think because these come together and because the financial sector is 5 to 10% of the economy, it does call for both public and private parts of the financial sector to come together to try to reach consensus. But let me be clear, this isn't a replacement for the larger societal debate. There has to be communication in both directions. And in addition to communication, larger societal choices like GDPR may override whatever the financial sector comes to. But I think if we don't come together, we're going to find ourselves stuck with rules that give insufficient room for appropriate tailoring for the financial sector. So that is the right answer, but I suspect others might disagree. So in terms of all these issues taken together, let's start with Laura.
Yeah, so When I think about what the conversation has been up here, where we're talking about making statements about our use of personal data transparent to consumers, when I think about making sure we're being fair with the use of what we're doing with the data, and your point about really just making sure that people understand what their rights are with respect to the data, I bring it together and say that what we really need to do is we need to fix the IT security, and I think that's a big focus of all of our organizations. But it's more than the IT security, it's also building the trust with the consumer or the claimant or the individual that's trusted us with their information. And so what we've done at Zurich is we've reached out to try to bridge that trust with our claimants, our customers around the world by going out publicly with an industry-leading data commitment. And our data commitment, which applies globally to our entire organization, is that we've promised our customers to keep their data safe. We've promised to never sell their personal data, to not share their personal data without being transparent with why we're using it, and to put their data to good work to protect them and to give them better products and to reduce their risk profile. And so when I think about making sure that somebody that's, a young person playing a game or a sophisticated buyer, I think the messages that Zurich is trying to put in the market is very simple to understand and a very simple commitment. And so I think that that's a way where we can start to bridge make sure we get past the obstacles of the disparate laws that we have and regulations, and we start to come together to really solution how we can build the trust with the individuals and between them and our companies.
Thank you, Laura. Vivian?
Interesting one. I think in terms of the financial services sector, the challenges, the ones I come across more frequently, are financial services regulators are very keen for firms to leverage as much data as possible to know their customers better, to understand and manage their risks better, and to create improved products that meet the needs of their customers. And so it's really about data maximization. And then on the privacy side, particularly in Europe where it's horizontal legislation, and increasingly we're finding in many jurisdictions throughout the world, privacy legislation is horizontal, not sectoral. In the US, it's much more sectoral. That there is a clash of cultures between privacy legislation, which is actually about data minimization. So it's really only use such data as is absolutely necessary for the purpose, not extra or otherwise. And I think a dialogue between what we're expecting on the financial services side and what we're expected to do on the privacy side really does need to take place in order to find the balance between the two. I'll give an example. In the UK, the UK ICO and the FCA have now signed an MOU, and it made a statement, rather, joint statement, to be clear to firms that in complying with your financial services obligations, it is not inconsistent with your obligations under the Data Protection Act, which articulates the GDPR. And that's incredibly helpful for organizations. So they have a clear understanding of where the balance lies in terms of the expectations. But we're not.
Sorry, can I follow you up on that? I know you gave it in very summary form, but that almost sounds like they just asserted it. Did they give any kind of help as to understand how you can achieve both things at the same time?
The question from industry has been, if I comply with my obligations as set out, which are principle-based and broad by the FCA, so I'm expected to interpret that and do what is reasonable and proportionate, is that the same measure that I'm expected to apply as to what is reasonable and proportionate on the privacy side? And the privacy regulator has articulated that if you're complying with your FCA obligations, which are not necessarily law, it's guidance, it's policy, it's etc., that is not inconsistent with your privacy obligations. So you can adjust your mindset from a broader one here and what you think is going to be narrow on this side to say, when I'm dealing with these obligations, I can feel fairly confident that I can meet what the FCA is asking without getting in trouble on the other side.
Thank you. And I interrupted you.
And I think so where I was going with that really is that that is a leading example of what it would be quite nice to see in other jurisdictions, both at the national level would be helpful, but I think what is far more important is on the international level, because at the end of the day, the financial ecosystem is global. Now, that's the conflict which we have lived in well before GDPR and we continue to live in today, which is the conflict of laws and subject to lots of multiple requirements, as the case may be. But I think that certainly it has become a much more important discussion now that we've seen a proliferation of privacy laws. There's 2/3 of the world now has privacy laws. If you wind back 10, 15 years, it was less than 25%. So 2/3 of the world now has privacy laws. So this is an issue that we can't afford to ignore. It is fundamentally important. And when we're seeing those privacy laws coming with massive amounts of enforcement, which are new, and the proliferation of that, it's something we absolutely have to address.
And I think, just to jump on that point, I think that what we're going to see is an increase in all sectors, but the financial sector in particular, but I think we will see an increase in all sorts of laws, increasing the amount of data type of requirements, right? So I'm going to jump on just a different type of issue, but we're beginning to understand the impacts of poor data quality, right? Whether that's data accuracy, completeness, timeliness, right? There's been panels today and during this event on artificial intelligence and machine learning. And so throughout those conversations, hopefully there's been discussions, and as a data officer, we understand that poor data quality, right, and inaccurate data, fake data, has real significant implications on machine learning and the results on bias and all of the implications on how that information will be applied and the difficulty on correcting that information if we put wrong information into the algorithmic processes and into the machines that will ultimately create the next set of conclusions that we will have less and less of an opportunity to interfere in. And so what's happening now is I think regulators are waking up in all different sectors, right, to begin to do regulation on data. And yet we've had data protection regulators, privacy regulators, FTC included, where they have been doing data regulation, and most of it has been focused on the human aspect of regulation and the fundamental aspects of personal information. But we have other types of information that is now going to be regulated with different definitional terms and different requirements. And I think it's going to be very difficult for industry, financial included, where we're going to have different definitional requirements. And I think Vivian gave a great example where two regulators in one nation have come together to actually try to harmonize one example. But I think that there is going to be an increasing need for that kind of harmonization of at least definitions. And we're seeing it in the European Union right now with different different parts of the Commission coming up with different definitions. And we're having a really hard time figuring out, okay, which definition wins under which law. And so how do we begin to harmonize some of those things as we go forward as industry who wants to innovate? And I think that's the real crisis that's going to start happening. Everybody is very well intentioned. Everybody wants to do the right thing to help with innovation, but at the very basic level of data definitions, I think that that's going to be one of the areas where we're going to need a lot of help as industry, period, and maybe as the financial industry in particular.
Yeah. Commissioner, thoughts? You deal with policy.
Sure, I mean, a lot of thoughts. With respect to the sort of inconsistency that I think a lot of firms see, that Joanne and Vivian were talking about, I think it's incumbent upon us as regulators, as government, to do our best to give reasonable guidance, consistent guidance, coherent guidance to players in the markets so that they know how to behave. I think it's also really important that those who participate in markets come to us and flag areas, come to legislators and other policymakers and flag areas where they may be caught in these kinds of traps. It's not always going to be self-evident when you're focused on one thing that something else is moving in a different direction. And to me, where that leads us as a policy matter is a really important point. And Laura, this is something you talked about, which is these issues come with trade-offs. There's a lot of talk right now. We were hearing about rights before. Especially when you talk about rights, people get very, very passionate. And I understand that. That makes perfect sense. But it's important not to be too essentialist and to understand that rights do come from somewhere, right? Government has to create them or people have to agree upon them, whatever the source. Without that, you can get a conversation that fails to take into account some of the trade-offs that we have. So we were talking about policy goals. I think, we were talking about innovation earlier.
Yeah.
That's critical. I think data security is a critical policy goal. I think the avoidance of consumer harm. So I'm a consumer protector. That's what I do for a living. But the other thing that I do for a living, which I think is really important for this discussion as well, and we haven't yet talked about it, and that's competition. We always have to keep in mind that robust competition in markets is something that we want. It's something that we hope will lead to the kind of innovation that leads companies to bid, whether on the B2B or the B2B side, to provide better products and better services. And we have to be careful because there are steps that we can take in terms of lawmaking, in terms of regulation that can impede that, and that can be a negative.
Yeah,
And
actually, I'm sorry, I was thinking, I probably should have asked at the beginning. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what the FTC does in this area. So what is the FTC's role? How do you interact with the other players? No, for
Sure.
the commissioner.
So that's important here because, of the alphabet soup of independent regulatory agencies in the United States, we may not be as well known to you. We are older than the rest. So the FTC does two things principally. The first thing is competition law. So we do antitrust. We have a pretty broad swath of the economy, although not banks. That's relevant here, and we share that for the most part with the Department of Justice Antitrust Division. The other side of the house, the side of the house that includes privacy, is the consumer protection side of the house. Principally, we focus on one law, which is about 80 years old, the FTC Act. Well, it's an amendment to the FTC Act. At any rate, unfair and deceptive acts and practices. That's what we're focused on. Market practices across the board can be related to finance. It can be related to a host of other things. Everything from garden variety consumer fraud to really complex privacy issues that you may have seen in the news recently. So there's unfair and deceptive acts and practices. And then there's a host of more specific statutes, for instance, to deal with privacy. But I want to pick up on something Joanne said, and that's accuracy. So we enforce FCRA, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and that's a statute that's been on the books for a very long time. It still applies today, and if you are taking data and you are offering products like credit, there are certain obligations under the law that you have. So it is very true that in this conversation we need to pay a lot of attention to all the new legislation and new regulation going on. It is also very true that all firms need to continue to pay attention to the laws that we have on the books, many of which are drafted sufficiently flexibly to be applied today.
Laura, I cut you off.
Yeah, so I was just going to make the point, I think, flowing from that is that we need to make sure as we're shaping the laws that we're making sure that it's a fair playing field. So by that I mean the fintechs and the insurtechs who are smaller maybe have less regulation. They're not maybe, in my case, for example, like regulated by the Department of Insurance. They may have more flexibility to do things with their data than a regulated insurance company in business for 100 years. So it's really important as we're trying to shape things that we make sure that we're making it fair for all the players in an industry.
Yeah, I mean, there is a question too on, we talk about definitions, right? So what is financial data and what is a financial firm, right? And, I mean, as we continue to evolve and innovate, right? So I understand what your point is, Laura. Yeah.
It's absolutely that. Well, I want to give the audience a chance here, and some of them have been kind enough to input their questions. I particularly like there's a pair of questions. One essentially asks what you think will be the impact of the consumer revolt that we're seeing. And the other question asks, consumers don't seem to give a damn, so why are we talking about these things? So you can see there's kind of conflicting views on how consumers are thinking. And of course, we know there's a significant difference between what they say and what they do. What are your thoughts about what consumers actually want and how that thinking may evolve over time? Any of you feel free to jump in.
I would say we all want to order the package and get the box on our door the next day, and nobody to do anything with our data or tell anybody what we bought. But the reality is that we've now given up our rights to our personal information when we did all of that. So I think our expectation is to build the trust. We need to build the trust with the companies that we're working with, or that as a company or as a consumer, there needs to be that trust and transparency with the sharing of the information so that we can meet in the middle between people wanting things and wanting to share their information, but also needing it to be protected and not used in an abusive or unethical way.
And I certainly think that's true. But there's more complexities here about consumer behavior we know.
Yes.
I mean, I'll give you one example, and here I'm the idiot. I normally use weather.com in the US to see what's likely to happen out there. When I went to Spain and tried using weather.com, it basically gave me the choice. Did I want to pay like $2 a day, or did I want to let them use the data? Data I'm perfectly sure they're using in the US without asking me. But I can't bring myself to say, yeah, go ahead, use the data. And I'm not willing to pay the $2 either. So I went to some other weather source. There's a lot of inconsistency in how people behave. And I think one of the reasons I paired these questions is, to some extent, as we design policy, we're guessing where the public will eventually get as they get smarter. So I saw you sort of quirk your face there, Noah. Did you have a comment?
No, I think you hit on a really important issue, which is that it isn't clear that everyone's preferences are the same.
Yeah.
Markets can be messy. Markets often are messy. We're not dealing, when we talk about privacy and the interest that individuals have about data, about something like price, where you can credibly predict that everyone's preference is the same. There are a lot of complicated trade-offs that go on. That's part of the transparency issue. And different people may assess those trade-offs differently. One of the corollaries in my mind to that is that when you make assumptions about policy and you have consumers in mind, it isn't enough just to imagine what you yourself would prefer.
Yeah.
You have to allow for the fact that we're not seeing that kind of general coherence. On the other hand, I think there are some things that are pretty easy to predict.
Right.
If you make a statement, if you make a commitment, not to pick on you, Laura, you should abide by that commitment. I can't think of a consumer who doesn't want that. But a lot of these issues are complex precisely because the trade-offs are not so easy, right? And the obvious preference of consumers are not always so clear to us.
So unfortunately, data is contextual, right?
Yeah.
And so data, you know, when I became the chief data officer, people would say to me, so Joanne, you're going to figure out our data strategy. And I said, and tell me our business strategy, and then we'll figure out the data strategy, right? Because data is contextual, guys, right? And so it goes to the fact that when you ask consumers the question about their data, which context are you asking them in? So when you talk about getting the package, they're perfectly comfortable if that data is then going to be used to give them a suggestion of another item or good from that very same merchant. It's not okay when it's all of a sudden popping up from some other merchant or some unknown source. All of a sudden, that's maybe a less comfortable moment. It's maybe not okay when it's a social network and that data there's something that they've done on social media that all of a sudden is popping up now from a different source, right? It's the question of coherence and cohesion and consistency, right? It's the question of, did I understand the second use, the third use of the data, right? The primary use is usually okay. So if my data is being used so that I can get the weather, and if I've paid $2 or if I've agreed to be tracked for my location, I'm okay to get the weather in my location. But I'm not maybe okay if all of my patterns of where I've traveled have now been sold to another person or another entity, and I didn't know it. That's where people begin to go, ooh, I didn't know it. And so that's really the challenge. That's the transparency issue. And so we did a survey a couple of years ago, and we found that personas emerge, right? And it's the typical thing. We had people who were privacy protective and people who we considered open sharers, and then there were 3 personas in between. But once you got into the context, right, it was the question of, was it clear? Was it clear that there was going to be reuse, right? And again, because we haven't really had a system where we understood that some services were being provided for free based on your data, we set up an ecosystem where that was clear, right? In the early stages of internet commerce. And that's where we are today. But consumers are quickly catching up that they're okay when it's a one-to-one bargain, that I understand the use. It's that second and tertiary use where it's inconsistent. So when you give your data to MasterCard or you swipe it at a merchant and then you get a call because we're worried about fraud, that feels like an okay use. But if I all of a sudden gave it to you, Laura, and it showed up in your insurance, algorithm, they would wonder, how did that purchase wind up with you, right? Those are the things that are the inconsistencies that consumers and individuals worry about. So I'm going to close on that because I think that's the thing that people really do care about. Those are the things that
let me
people worry.
follow up on a related question, because one of the questions from the audience essentially was about governance. So this is a question I have for the three private sector people here. I don't think it's probably relevant for the commissioner. What governance mechanisms do you have at your firms in terms of thinking about ethical use of data? So maybe I'll start with you, Vivian.
So I think that the ethical element is increasingly a significant aspect of how we govern. The governance of data is evolving because how your governance structure is not only dependent on the laws that you're complying with, but it's also the culture of your organization as well. And I think what firms have come to realize is that there is more to governance than doing what is required. So just because it's legal doesn't make it right. And I think the ethical element is now an increasingly significant part of the governance structure. And I think you gave me a nice opportunity there just to mention the cultural piece, because certainly I think one of the aspects that's really critical in terms of considering who is the consumer is to remember that there is a cultural context to that as well. People in one jurisdiction feel very differently than people in another jurisdiction to the same set of circumstances. And I think that cultural context absolutely can't be ignored. But in terms of governance, it's both the legal bit, the company culture, and what's now coming to the fore, and I think is really fundamentally important, is the discussion around the ethical piece as well. What feels right, what is the expectation, and just because it's legal doesn't mean you can do it.
But in terms of your own company's internal governance, is there someone who's responsible for ethical use of data?
Yes.
Is there a board committee? I mean, what formal processes do you have?
There's a huge, well, I mean, I'm sure
I was
you've
going
got
to
it as
say,
well.
we would need to do a whole panel on this, honestly,
Yes.
with the number of processes. But I would say that it's part of our product development process, number one, right? So, security, privacy, the data team all have different checks and balances within the product development process, right? So that's number one. All of our products and solutions are vetted with the individual in mind. Even though that we are a B2B company, we're also a B2B2C brand, right? So we have to take into account how all of our products and solutions will be perceived by consumers, because we interact with consumers indirectly, right? So all of our innovations are looked at through a product management excellence process, right? So that's number one. So that's how all of our products and solutions are vetted. All other decisions, right, are also done through a data governance body, which I chair, but there are multiple levels to that. So, and then I do a report to the board, as does our privacy officer and our chief security officer. So there's multiple ways that data is governed at our firm.
Okay, thank you. And Laura, you're actually off the hook because we've run out of time.
Okay, I was going to say it's consistent at Zurich.
All right, fair enough. Thank you all. Thank you, audience, as well.